shifting our evaluation of this change from having a misguided right to eat cheaply to embracing the righteous privilege of eating equitably is crucial. And I feel like this was a sentence that was the byproduct of a lot of reading, thinking, uh, uh, reflecting. And I feel like this is the crux of this book. And that is that there's a lot of soul searching that I think we all need to do about what we take for granted at the dinner table or at the bar. And the reality is, if we want to move the food system and the drink system to a place where we want it to be, we're just going to drink and eat different things. And we have to feel righteously proud of that because it's going to be what's needed.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I am Chris LeBeau. Today we have an interesting conversation that is always part of the cocktail world, but in this case, we're going to put it at the center of things as opposed to on the side, where it often lays. So the subject of today's conversation is a book coming out on June 11th called The Bartender's Pantry, which focuses on things like beverage mixers, garnishes, and more that are all part of the drink experience. The book was spearheaded by Jim Meehan, the author of books like The PDT Cocktail Book and Meehan's Bartender's Manual, and Bart Sasso, a designer and partner of the Atlanta-based bar Ticonderoga Club. Several years into the project, after accumulating just a wealth of knowledge, Bart and Jim were staring at it all and weren't really sure how to turn this into a clear and interesting story. So they convinced journalist and author Emma Jansen, who has co-authored several books like The Way of the Cocktail by Julia Momose and The Bartender's Manifesto by Toby Maloney, as well as her own book on Mezcal and plenty of others, to sign on. While it was very much a group effort to bring this book to life, in this conversation, Jim shares one of the moments that really spurred him to think about bringing a book like this to life and reflect on the fact that there were many things about certain ingredients that he accepted more on blind faith than had really investigated. In the book, you're going to find categories like sugars, spices, dairy, grains, nuts, coffee and tea, fruit, ferments, and more. You're going to learn about items that belong to each category and their nuance. And as Emma put it during our conversation, every one of these categories has its own set of social, political, environmental, and economic issues. We want to make them more transparent. Part of this is about sourcing and finding things that align with your values. Emma was also quick to point out one of the tangible benefits of reading a book like this, citing her own life. As she put it, by better understanding tea through the research, it gave her a deeper appreciation for it, led her to think more about what tea she was buying, and invest more in the process of brewing it, which ultimately leads to a better tasting cup. Since the news and social media can often leave us all feeling a little bit down at times these days, a bright spot of the book is Jim talked about coming out much more hopeful on the other end. He talks about all the kind subject matter experts, farmers, and more that he met along the way, including one guy down in Georgia who Jim called out of the blue looking for sorghum syrup, and the guy was like, just put a check in the mail and I'll send you some. So Jim felt like he discovered a lot of very human moments in the course of this. You know, at a time when many of us are working from home or just have more isolated lives, no matter what you're really doing, one of the biggest things he thinks we can all easily do, regardless of where you shop, farmer's market, supermarket, is get to know the people who work there. If you want to see oat milk or some ingredient, rather than eye rolling them or really kind of posting a negative review or just being like resentful. It's like, oh, if you get to know people, they might be like, oh, I didn't know anybody wanted this. We can all work through our want to kind of source better ingredients to build relationships in the process. Finally, in addition to all of their hard work, the book is also supported by drink recipes, infusions, and syrups from a host of people from around the industry. So it really is kind of a fun, rich, diverse read. You can find the book online at on Instagram at Bartender Pantry or thebartenderspantry.com. You can find Jim online on Instagram at Mixography, Mixography. Emma is Emma Jansen. Jansen is Janzen. And Bart is at Bart Sasso, Sasso. There's links for all of this in the show notes, everybody. Enjoy this conversation. So, Jim, mixers are often kind of something we talk about in a book, as a result of the fact that we're talking about cocktails or spirits. Having run programs, written so many books, where was the kernel or the lightning strike moment for you when suddenly you were like, were you tired of just looking all these things up as you were making drinks? What kind of sparked this project for you in the first place?
So I've talked about this a lot, and I'm not sure if it's clearly spoken out through the book, but there was, on the last book's tour, I was in a cocktail bar in Philadelphia in between events, and I sat down at a bar and I scanned the back bar as I do at every bar I go to, and I saw a bottle of pasteurized lime juice thawing on the back bar in public sight. And my first thought as a crusty old cocktail bartender is like, why is there a bottle of pasteurized lime juice thawing on the back bar in this bar that is masquerading as a craft cocktail bar? Obviously the grumpy get off my lawn guy in me was like, the juice is supposed to be fresh. You're supposed to get to work early, squeeze the juice fresh. And that was my initial instinct. And that instinct is kind of predicated upon a person who grew up in a world where I saw advertisements that were like, this is your brain and this is your brain on drugs, with the egg, with the egg frying in the cast iron pan. And so I feel like the way I was raised was this very binary sort of right way, wrong way, in the culinary world as well. And so I think that Pavlovian response as a grumpy guy seeing that bottle on the back bar was, immediately checked by the young dad in me, who has been trying to disarm that Pavlovian binary way that I was raised. And the more I thought about that bottle, the more I thought, you know what, I remember moving to New York in 2002 and seeing Dale DeGroff doing talks to young bartenders about the importance of fresh squeezed juice when people were still using, sour mix out of the gun. And I remember that how important that was for me in that sort of binary Pavlovian way of of course we must use not just juice that we thaw from a lemon, but actually squeeze lemons before service. And that was something that really was the beginning of the cocktail renaissance. The cocktail renaissance didn't begin with celebrity tequila or craft gin. It began with Dale DeGroff telling the story of fresh squeezed juice and his program at the Rainbow Room, and Tony Abou-Ganim bringing that to the Bellagio, where he got union bartenders at a casino to do a fresh juice program. And so knowing that the cocktail renaissance was predicated on fresh juice, I thought about that 17 years, 20 years later, and realized because of food technology, because of this new generation of young bartenders, there's another thing that could potentially be going on. One, today's young bartenders haven't heard Dale's message. And so that message needs to be either reiterated, or that message in the day of super juice, which hadn't yet occurred in 2017, but was coming, needs to be updated for a generation of bartenders that are working amidst climate catastrophe and in an attempt to work in a more sustainable way. And that was kind of where the beginning of this book began, is all right, there's that bottle of lime juice. There's another opportunity to tell a story about juice. What do I need to know about citrus? And then it began. So then it kind of went systematically from like citrus to all other sort of like culinary ingredients and cocktails.
Yeah, I think jumping more to the end of the book, but to me, I think one of the more profound moments was me as the person who has his devoted, pour over coffee setup upstairs, and like there is the way that it is done. While I have friends who are geeks at a level that I am not, like the idea that like the Arabica bean is the superior bean, and in the book you talk about Arabica versus Robusta coffee beans, and that sure, at many times historically this was a superior bean, but based on changing climate or how we begin to care for it, this is not an absolute. And so I think there's moments to the deep dive that you guys did as a team to kind of look at like where is the dogma, the doctrine, and are we actually sure that all of it's right? And so I think that is the interesting thing about when you're dissecting dairy or spices or these things. How do we think about these things categorically in terms of, again, the story we tell ourselves versus what might actually be true?
And I think that exactly. And I think that the other sort of like space that I continually came back to was going back to my childhood where my mom, there's an image in the introduction where, it's my mom's Lipton tea with milk in the morning and my dad's Stewart's coffee with cream in the morning. And I brought up the fact that like growing up in the like 70s and 80s with the like advent of the microwave, during this time when it was like really the industrialization of food had kind of like reached its apotheosis in the 80s where like this was like progress is like instant coffee, not just for astronauts, but for everybody. And like, industrial grade tea for everybody. And it's cheap and it's fast. And it's like, and the thing that I kept going back to is like, my parents are somewhat aggressive people, but they still drink that coffee and tea. And so I think that that's the other place, going back to what you're talking about with the coffee and the dogma, is that my parents, even though like I'm the way I am, still drink instant coffee or like almost instant coffee and CTC tea, and I love them. So knowing that these people who are quite progressive, who I love, have not adopted any of these things that I'm interested in, that reckoning with that sort of dissonance is something that I think like Emma and I really had to dig into. Is like, okay, what are the biases that we have culturally as, a man or a woman, or being cisgendered, or being white, or being from the Midwest, or being raised the way we were, where we were? How can we engage with this and understand the way that our what we eat and drink are and what we prioritize culturally are all predicated in systems, some of which some of us are trying to like tear down or at least replace with more inclusive and regenerative systems.
Yeah, I think one thing that came up right early on, and having had this conversation recently with, grain farmers in Colorado or whatever, but there are certain areas where now, to many of our worlds, but speaking to Emma's world in particular, the agave world right now, we are so putting in many of the, when it's done properly, I should say, like we have the name of who the farmer is, who the humidor and the distillery and all these things on it. But when it comes to like the question about our grains or whatever, like, I mean, how many of us are getting to that level of knowing that it came from this farm? Or, one of the things I thought was so interesting is, not having stood next to, cinnamon, before, it's like, oh, the idea that behind every one of these little cinnamon sticks that's rolled right there, these are all hand rolled. And so for many of
Mm-hmm.
us, what's it? I think it's also AJ Abrams does a book on like trying to thank everybody that brought his coffee to him, like from all the way, like, the person who paved the road, and yeah, all the steps that happened, like the people hand rolling your herbs, all the traceability of these things is kind of always a big thing in terms of just not looking at cinnamon as cinnamon, but it came from a place and was handled by a person at that point in
Yeah.
time.
That was something
So,
that we initially, like when Bart and I were working on the illustrations, we had finished beverages as chapter head illustrations for all of the book, and then we used those to sell the book. And after Emma and I finally finished writing these chapters, we like thought I thought about it, and I was like, we've written 10 chapters about the people that make these things, and we realized like we need to redraw this to reflect the fact that people bring us coffee and people harvest our fruits and vegetables. And the biggest sort of takeaway from this book, sorry to spoil it for all of you listeners, is the goal of trying to build community around how making drinks and serving them to people, and like really extending that community all the way into the fields, into the people that grow our foods.
mm-hmm. The consumerist, capitalist, all our favorite word society that we've built is the thing we're working with. So I'm curious, for Bart, Emma, Jim, like how do we wrestle with? So right now, the world that we live in is not getting any cheaper for any of us to live in. And yet, like when we buy discount cinnamon or milk or whatever, that's a choice that is likely feeding, another part of the system. But none of these, making any of these choices for a bar or at home is going to make a cocktail cheaper, right? Now, I think for many people, I always tell them who are worried about calories in cocktails, I'm like, how about you just have like one or two really good ones as opposed to seven or eight, boring ones? Now, that's one way to look at the world, but how do we begin to think about people trying to make these decisions and still live within their means? That's a giant macro question. But as you were writing this and kind of are thinking about this, what, how should people kind of take this? Is it kind of, try to do a little bit better, or how do you guys think about this? I don't know. Is that even a manageable question?
Yes. So when Emma and I were working on the introduction to this, and she did a lot of heavy lifting on the introduction, and I did a lot of heavy editing. So I have no idea whether if Emma wrote this or I wrote it. We both workshopped it regardless. But there's a section in the introduction called sourcing suggestions. And the second sourcing suggestion says, be prepared to pay more. High quality ingredients are going to cost more money because it takes time, labor, and resources to grow them, plus additional resources to properly process, source, and retail them. Every person along the food chain deserves to make a wage that provides quality of life, and you're paying for that on the consumer end too. As author Dan Saladino puts in Eating to Extinction, we get the food system we pay for. For the vast majority of us with limited resources, investing in this means certain ingredients will go from seasonal staples to items we splurge on for special occasions. And then this was a sentence that like Emma or I wrote that I like look back on, and I'm like, sort of, I don't really like admire my work, but I looked at this sentence and I was like, this is it. And it's shifting our evaluation of this change from having a misguided right to eat cheaply to embracing the righteous privilege of eating equitably is crucial. And I feel like this was a sentence that was the byproduct of a lot of reading, thinking, reflecting. And I feel like this is the crux of this book. And that is that there's a lot of soul searching that I think we all need to do about what we take for granted at the dinner table or at the bar. And the reality is, if we want to move the food system and the drink system to a place where we want it to be, we're just going to drink and eat different things. And we have to feel righteously proud of that because it's going to be what's needed.
Yeah, I think the thing that I took from that as well, and Chris, I have the unique perspective of working with Jim or having worked with Jim on this book is kind of from the user's perspective or the audience perspective. I'm not nearly as qualified in beverage as Emma or Jim are. I'm in the industry. I have a restaurant in Atlanta, but the bar team is the bar team, and I am the design and marketing team primarily, which was my role in this book as well. But I worked very closely with Jim through all of this, and some of the things that I took from this were not only the sourcing of better things and the fact that they're going to cost more, but also the fact that when you do source those better things, the book provides insights into not only preserving them, but also second uses for them. And it started to change the way I was thinking about mint is a great example, even in my house, or herbs. Instead of taking that mint that you went to the farmer's market to buy and throwing it in a Ziploc bag in your fridge, you can follow a thoughtful process and how to preserve it for a much longer time. So while you may be spending more on some of these ingredients, I think that there are a lot of examples within this book and that demonstrate not only how to store them, how to use them, but also there's even recipes for second uses. The kvass is a great example of that, using old bread, for example. So
Yeah, I think obviously for the alchemy at the bar, you guys even take the time to point out, oh, like some teas are great for a second or third steep. What is it? I think
right.
like dark teas are like two or three steeps versus green might be only two. But yeah, so I think some of those reuses, and another thing that we're probably guilty of in our own way, is in the era of Costco or just buying stuff in general, right? Is like, oh, not that we don't, maybe some of us aren't feeling the pinch, but like this purchasing this thing in bulk or more than I need immediately, the cost of if this goes bad isn't that high when it comes to replace it. So if I just have to throw apples out, who cares? And so hopefully we're not being that flagrant, but we don't treat it with as much respect because it is, an inconsequential sum in that way. And so, yeah, so to your point, Bart, that does kind of really resonate with that way, as opposed to shopping responsibly, because if it, it's like, yeah, if we, anyways, yes, yeah.
It's interesting you bring up Costco because I feel like going back to checking my biases, like my portion of this book was written from Portland, Oregon, which has been lampooned on shows like where, the Portlandia episode famously about the chicken. And I just feel like this book is not about food shaming people, or it's not about, pushing my liberal biases, into people's barrooms and dining rooms. And I think that, like, hopefully for people that do shop at Costco, one of the nuggets that they'll get from this book that I suggest in the sourcing suggestion is like to get to know the people who work at your grocery store or where you shop for your food. And I feel like get to know the buyer, if there's no maybe coconut milk, or if there's no condensed milk that you're looking for in a recipe, and maybe you could sort of, have an influence on what's sold at Costco. Our goal for this book is not really getting everyone to follow this in lockstep. It's to open up people's mind to the ecosystem of people in our foodways, and that includes the shop clerk that's stocking the aisles at Costco, and building. I don't know. Like I feel like in some ways, like it's bigger than the individual ingredients. It's a book about people too, and about their collective dignity and humanity, and making them feel how grateful we should be that they keep food in our food systems, so that people are not hungry.
Yeah, no, thank you for straightening that out. And I don't think that's where I meant to go as much as I just feel like in an era where it's easy to overbuy, and you could overbuy at any supermarket or even a farmer's market, right? And so to Bart, going back to Bart's point, like understanding better preservation, or just sometimes if we end up with more than because that's how it's packaged, it could be a consequence of things we buy. But yeah, this isn't, to your point, I didn't come here to ring out Costco shoppers or whatnot. Yeah, and I will say as well, I mean, it was right at the end of the book, but to kind of quote the book back to you, what was this? Benjamin Lohr, The Secret Life of Groceries. Yeah, like a thing that resonates to me, because I always just look at, now we of course have even cocktails are on TV, courtesy of Netflix, but like with the food TV industrial complex, the line, as a culture, we do a generally excellent to overzealous job thinking about food, a highly conflicted job thinking about its origins in the natural world as a living thing, and spend almost no time thinking about our groceries as retail products. And so I think it's interesting to think about a world where you're watching food television, but maybe eating a frozen dinner. And that doesn't mean that like you're a bad person, but like we can love the romance and the story of these things, and yet our actions around them don't always mirror them. And so like, but better understanding how to think about the ingredients as you dive into things like, dairy or tea, et cetera, kind of helps us better understand like the decisions we're making. Because yeah, what's also a line in the book, some of this, like with every interview, it's like some of these conversations are so big. It's like, how do you even unpack them? But like, the dairy system, there's the line in there about like, it's a staggeringly crazy system. And like the fact that we can put milk on the shelf at this price, it's an astounding thing. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing, you mentioned a frozen dinner while you're watching Top Chef, and I think that part of something that has happened that in the last 10 years is like the sort of industrialization of craft cocktails, where like you can now get a craft cocktail in a can, or in a bottle. And I think that this book also is not against canned cocktails or necessarily that industrialization, but I think that something that isn't mentioned in the book, but that was the environment in which the book was written in, is that as we've all become increasingly more online and increasingly work from home instead of in offices, and obviously, like, we wrote this during a pandemic, there's a lot of people are very lonely right now. Like, they don't, and if you work from home, if you work online, if you work remotely, the amount of people that you talk to on a daily basis can get very small very quickly. If in addition to working from home and online, you don't go to the grocery store anymore, you have like your groceries delivered, or you have your food delivered, or you buy, frozen food. So I just feel like one of the benefits that I think we are hoping to tout in this book is that in order to make some of these recipes, you're going to have to go to a store and you're going to have to talk to somebody. And that process is going to be, hopefully it'll be exciting. Hopefully you'll meet somebody new. And hopefully when you go to a store that you've never been to get an ingredient that you've never heard of, you'll meet someone in that store who will know a lot about that ingredient and other things, and you'll build a relationship. And I think that, to me, is like one of the biggest goals of this book, is like to build, for people to meet people and talk to people and learn things and be in community with folks that they're not perhaps in right now, but they would really enjoy if they just knew they were out there. They just needed a reason to go to that store.
Mm-hmm. To your point about hopefully the book also providing insight to things, one of the things I remember, the questions I sent over in advance, if there's other parts where jumping around the book too much, point me in any direction you guys want to run, but were you able, Jim, over the course of thinking about dairy milk and milk alternatives, again, like there's the conversation about like, cows are the dairy industrial complex is a huge environmental toll. And yet if like the conversation lingering around the circle with almond milk is how water thirsty, almonds are. Oat milk hasn't really won my heart yet. Sorry for people who are fans of it, but we all have to make our decisions, but do you feel like, did you learn enough about like what you feel like is the better of the two decisions based on your research there?
I think that Ann Mendelssohn's latest book, she wrote 2 books on dairy, and dairy was one of those ones that I felt like I lacked the brain power to answer the question you're sort of posing right now. Like, I lacked the insight. I felt there are certain subjects that I feel like spices, for instance, or tea, or even coffee, where there's like so many great books out there, and like I know a lot of people, so I felt really well served in my research. And it wasn't until I found Ann Mendelssohn's work writing, and she wrote a book about 15 years ago, and her latest book actually came out when Emma and I were like on deadline, and I bought it as soon as it came out. And the title, I'm spacing on it, it's in the other room. It has like a very sort of like flashy sort of title that is eye-catching, but it's basically the book on milk for me. And I think, in answer to your question, I think that her sort of like where she concluded, which was where I concluded, since I generally was picking up everything she was putting down, is that the early history of dairying was, these nomadic herders who mostly were consuming dairy in the form of like quick ferment yogurt drinks, or like something to fresh cheese, or quick ferment yogurts, because the fermentation process, digested the lactose and made it digestible and nutritious for humans. And it wasn't until many hundreds of years later that, like, Northern Europeans developed, the sort of gut bacteria to digest milk without getting sick. So I just think that the fluid milk, as she calls it, like the kind of cold milk industry that the cold pasteurized milk industry that we were all raised upon in the United States is, I think she describes, like, going back to what you're saying before about just like the wildness that this is a normal beverage instead of like an insane luxury. I mean, dairy, like milk was typically, went from a nipple to a mouth, like an infant mouth. Like, so the channel that fresh milk used to travel was mother's nipple to infant mouth. And now we all can go to like a gas station and get a gallon of it. So I think that, like, that was the framing she used to just describe how cartoonishly, like, wild this idea of a giant milk industry there is, that was like taken out of that kind of intimate channel. And so I think that, like, with that framing, you can begin to see how, yes, the dairy industry is cartoonish. But I think that in the same way that it's very hard to put something that large back into its bottle, I think that there are ways in which we can evolve that industry, looking at the health of the animals, the health of the land, the health of the farmers, and begin to sort of right size it, I think, so that so we can find some new happy medium. And for me, that's going to involve more dairy fermentation, probably in the form of yogurt or fresh cheeses. I think with respect to, like, whether people, I think Emma and I have, I think, thankfully avoided coming out, against, I mean, like, I definitely included passages in that chapter that related to the human cost of dairy farming, meaning like the suicide rate of dairy farmers, the rate of dairy farms, small dairy farms going out of business, the environmental toll of dairy animals, of the many countries that are now cutting down forest lands and jungle to graze cattle for dairy and for meat. So I feel like it is a big thing, but I think Emma and I eventually landed that we need not abolish this thing that we've sort of all grown up with. I think it goes back to the big alcohol question, which is the elephant in the room as well, which is just that, like, we don't think fresh milk needs to go away. We just think we probably need to consume much less of it, and the quality of the fresh milk that we consume needs to be much higher than it is generally available now, if that makes sense. And if you're vegan or vegetarian and you want to have almond milk or oat milk, I think the same thing goes there. Like, should you drink a pint of almond milk a day? No. Like, can you put it a splash of it in your coffee? Yes, that's okay.
Yeah, I think to take it to like a top level, every one of these categories of ingredient that we go into in this book, every single one of them has its own set of unique, like, political, social, environmental, economic issues. And we try to touch on some of those, not at great length, right? Because this is a handbook, but I think something that we try to encourage in doing that is to make those issues transparent, and also to show you that, like, part of sourcing is figuring out how to source these ingredients in a way that aligns with your values, right? So, like, these are some of the indications, these are some of the issues that you should look at. If you care about water usage, maybe you're not going to go and use almond milk, right? If you care about something else, that's going to change your mind as well. And also kind of looping back in on what Jim was moving towards, I think there's also this point that having a diverse diet is a good thing, right? Because a lot of the problems within each category have come from the fact that most of these categories of ingredients have become super industrialized, right? They've become monocultures. So we go to the store, we can only find one kind of tomato, right? One kind of banana. And so if you were to say, well, I'm only ever going to drink almond milk again, then that, could encourage that industry to kind of go in that direction, right? So like we talk about this in agave spirits a lot, which is like, no, you shouldn't only drink aspirin or only drink a wild agave or only drink this one kind. Have a diverse diet, kind of spread out the love, in a way that aligns with your values.
Yeah, and I'd add one of the other, and this may have been one of your guys' lines, but you said, yeah, each one of these ingredients has a complex history with thorny ethical considerations and quality benchmarks. And to your point, Jim, of kind of being like, hey, well, with dairy, let's reference Ann Mendelsohn here. Yeah, I think one of the things people will find in the book is certainly, that if they're looking for the other subject matter experts, I mean, that's what you certainly, when you and Bart were crazy enough to take on this, what was it, like 5 years or something, or 4 years before you brought Emma in? I'm just imagining Emma walking into a room and your hair, like everybody just being like wigged out or whatever. If she's like, all right, let's boil this thing down a little bit. But you guys went to, these primary experts to try to cultivate a lot of the insights on spices or coffee, whatever. And so there's plenty of great secondary reading for people on any of those categories that they want to go deeper in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we haven't touched on it yet, but one of the ways in which that we approach this is that I feel like we live in a world of specialists right now where if you want to know about milk, you go to one milk expert. Or if you want to know about tequila, you go to like your agave expert, and it manifests in our lives too. Like if you have a heart problem, you go to your cardiologist, or if and I think our culture has specialists to solve and address all of our specific concerns. And I think that as I thought back to my days as a 90s bartender, when I before the internet, I used to have to know, I couldn't look things up on Google. So I had to actually know some things. And if I wanted to know about them, I had to learn them from books. And as a bartender, I had to know the jukebox and I had to know what was going on at what the theater across the street was playing. And I needed to know a little bit about everything. And I think that the spirit of this book goes back to those days before everything was in our, smartphone in our pocket, where Emma and I or Bart are not experts on dairy, but we are interested enough about dairy that we went out and found as much interesting and compelling information as we could possibly compile so we could create, and we put it in a digestible handbook so that you could, as an interested person, could read a little bit about it and decide how much further you wanted to go with it. And I think that that's the spirit of this book, is that it's okay to know a little bit about a lot of things and be interested in a lot of things and be an expert in none of them. I don't think I'm not an expert in any of these things. So it was, and I'm not a trained journalist. So, I mean, at a certain point, that was where I knew I was in over my head. And I was reading Emma's latest 2 books and I was like, I'm going to ask this person if she can help me, because right now I feel I'm overwhelmed. And I think that getting Emma on board was really, it was a process to convince her of the worth of the project. Cause I think I was all over the place when we first started talking about it. And really, she was the person who was able to distill this into a cohesive narrative, as opposed to a bunch of great sticky ideas that needed form, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I do love how, I mean, we did work hard to make sure that Jim already had an incredible head start on all of the research that he'd done and all of the books that he'd read and the experts that he'd interviewed and read their work on. By the time I came in, I didn't have to do a lot of heavy lifting on that front. It was really just let's make a list of all the books, all of the contributors, all of the experts in their fields, and let's just eyeball it and make sure that we're really sending people towards really brilliant, experts and scholars in their fields. So not only does this book, like Jim said earlier, like encourage you to go out and talk to people in the real world, if you just use it as a reference to like figure out what books you should go read about sugar, what books you should go read about vegetables, it's also super helpful in that respect as well, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought like the way that, we're talking about fructose versus sucrose and yeah, just different ways to think about like what's kind of making up various subcategories was very helpful in that regard. You know, Jim, I feel like in a good way, you've kind of been saying, hey, like this is us handing, hopefully, to Emma's term, this is a handbook, and this is not like, this is not what was it? Oh, the Oxford Companion that Wondrich rolled out a while ago. But for and this could vary regionally, ethically, and all these things. So, like one of the questions I sent over, I don't know how this one processed for you, but if you're a bar owner and you're punching out reliable daiquiris and old fashions and whatever, I mean, are there, if someone was just in conversation with you and they were looking for either flavorful or ethical decisions they'd be making based on various mixers, spices, etc., are there a couple things you would encourage them to think about? And obviously, it's all food for thought for them. But if someone's like, "Well, where do I go from here?" What might you say based on what you've learned?
Um, I think that going back to, well, I mean, the first thing I would say with respect to uh, answering that question is that, and we've sort of alluded to it throughout our answers to this, is that it's people need to make these decisions on their own. Like they sort of like, I can't, there's no sort of like, I don't think we came to too many universal conclusions in this book. And like, I think the universal conclusion I mentioned earlier is that people, in order to righteously approach this stuff, are going to have to start imagining drinking less. I think that one of the things I've found as I've grappled with my own health in my nearly 30 years in this industry is that cocktails are not salad. That the idea that the way, but I drank old fashions like salad in the early aughts. And so I think that I think as all of these decisions about what you serve at your bar and what the ethics or the value of it has to come down to, I guess I've come to a point in my career where, if I'm brutally honest with myself, I think I've spent the first 20 years of my career getting people who are already interested in drinking cocktails much more interested in drinking cocktails. And I've spent very little time getting people who don't drink cocktails interested in cocktails. And when I say that, I mean people who drink wine or beer or like are open to drinking some alcohol, but they just don't drink cocktails for whatever reason. And I think that as I think about the next half of my career, which I hope I have another big half left, is I would like to spend more time not getting people to like drink 3 daiquiris a day, but more to consider a daiquiri as a worthwhile use of their however much alcohol they drink instead of a glass of wine or a beer. And I think that part of the reason why is like opening a bottle of beer or a can of beer or opening a bottle of wine and pouring yourself your 4.5 glasses is not, it's not very, if you're like a wine nerd and and you like got the wine from the winery, it's a totally different experience. Same thing with beer. Like maybe you brew your own beer and it's like a great thing. But very few people who are drinking wine or beer make their own beer or like go to the winery to get their wine. So I think with cocktails, there's very much, we saw this during the pandemic when people were making sourdough and cocktails. People really realized like, oh, I made this. And there's this sense of pride that comes with like, yeah, I learned how to make this daiquiri. You want me to make you one at my house or whatever? And like people really get into it in the way that bartenders do too. And I think that for me, I want to spend the next 20 years trying to get people interested in making drinks and making drinks either in their bars or their homes. And as it relates to on-premise, I think that a lot of bar operators are going to have to try to think about how they can still make enough to like pay, to keep the doors open, but not facilitate toxic binge drinking. Like, and I think that is one of the contributors in our book. Ravi Crozin just opened a very small tea house here called Bardo, and he has a gong fu tea service where you can get like a $20 cup of Phoenix oolong, and you can brew it yourself, with these beautiful classic Chinese brewing equipment. And I feel like we'll see if it works. But I feel like it is exactly what I'm talking about. Very few people are going to be surprised when they see $25 cups of tea of pu'er at his space. But I think that what a lot of people don't understand about bars and restaurants is really like the biggest cost of doing business is your fixed cost is usually your rent. And so if people could charge more for a drinking experience, but actually, serve less drinks, then they could still keep their businesses open and be profitable. And when I go to Japan, I see that. I see someone order a very nice drink and they sit with it for an hour. And maybe they order a second one in the second hour, but it's not like someone going to a bar and drinking 3 or 4 drinks in an hour. And I feel like that for me it's why I gravitate more and more towards working in a restaurant now instead of working in a cocktail bar, is that going out and serving someone 5 or 6 very strong cocktails doesn't feel as good to me as it did before I knew what I know now.
Bart, I know you said you've got the bar team who is certainly making Ticonderoga Club, run, but as you kind of worked your way through this project, have you found, how has your conversations, if they have, like, changed with your team about, I don't know, either what we're serving or what we have behind the bar? Have you seen that play out at all yet?
Yeah, I mean, well, 2 of my partners are contributors in the book, both with process recipes and cocktail recipes. I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough to work with contemporaries of Jim who think very much like him. And sustainability and being economical and thoughtful with your ingredients has always been a priority with my partners. If anything, they prepared me to work on this book in a lot of ways. I saw a lot of very similar ideologies as I got further into the subject matter with Jim, and maybe in a different way, it's helped me understand them a little bit better. I feel like, and some of the ways they do things where that could be done easier, and sometimes I'm a little confused as to why they choose the path they do, especially when we look at our P&L. But having worked with this book for so long and really engrossing myself in it and learning so much from Jim and Emma, I understand that a lot better now, and I understand what makes our bar special. And hospitality is such a big thing for us at Ticonderoga Club, but also the quality and the care given to our ingredients, the cocktails. And I think, to Jim's point, we are one of these newer establishments that encourages our guests to be more thoughtful in both their selections and their consumption as well, for sure. I know that we say that we're a restaurant first, as opposed to a cocktail bar. And I think that was not something people were expecting from seasoned barmen like Greg Best and Paul Calvert. But I think they've arrived at many of the same conclusions Jim has in terms of what we want to gravitate towards in the second halves of our career in this industry. And that is serving people in a more responsible manner, 100%.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
One of my favorite experiences with this book was the What Cheer cocktail that Paul sent has a sorghum syrup. And I'd never worked with sorghum syrup, so I asked him where to get it. And he said that they get it from a farmer's market. And I Googled it, and I ended up finding the name of this farm is called Hughes Farm. And so I ended up Googling Hughes Farm. There was a phone number. I called Hughes Farm, and someone with a deep, gravelly voice answered the phone. And it was the owner of Hughes Farm. And I asked him about the sorghum syrup, if there's anywhere I could buy it. And he said I could buy it from him. And he asked me how much I wanted. And so I I asked him, what sizes that you sell it in, and I ended up buying 2 jugs of it that were like pretty giant jugs, and I asked him how I could pay for it, if I could get online and pay for it, and he told me that I should send him a check, and I said, "You want me to write a check and send you a check?" And he's like, "Yes," and I'm like, "And you're going to put it in the mail?" And yeah, so I bought 2 jugs of sorghum syrup from Hughes Farm, and this farmer put them in the mail on the honor system, and I put a check in the mail, and that's how I got it. And it reminded me of when Don Lee created the Benton's Old Fashioned at PDT. And at one point, like, we were having trouble getting the bacon fat from Momofuku, and I thought maybe I could find, Benton's bacon. And I called Benton's farm in Tennessee, and Alan Benton picked up the phone. Like, it was just one of those moments, like, you never know who's going to pick up the phone at one of these farms, and it might just be the person who owns the farm and is like the famous face of the business. And so I think that was a perfect example of, like, as a northerner, had no experience or awareness of like what good sorghum syrup is or where to get it. And because of Paul and because of the internet and because I just picked up the phone, like, I had a retail experience that I'll tell that story for the rest of my life, because I just love the idea of just put a check in the mail and I'll mail it to you, and I trust you. Like, it's just a wild and wonderful thing to me that, like, that still exists in 2024 in America.
It truly
like
is
sending,
the best sorghum too. Truly.
like sending, like, I'm like this, guy in Portland, Oregon calls, Northern Georgia, and it's like, "Hey, can I have some syrup?" And he's like, "Sure." It's like in our divided, fractured world, like, sure, like, I'll send it. I just think it's wonderful. And it's to me, it is a source of that is like this making this book was very hopeful. Like, there are these sort of interactions fill me with hope for our lonely, divided country.
And one of the things I think as well, Jim, is that this doesn't always have to cross like an conservative, progressive, urban, rural lines. But I think about it in a time when we do have people have more interest in where their food or drinks are coming from more and more, that at times the people that are growing or making your product that you love, this super cute farming group or whatever out in the rural part of Missouri or wherever, like, they might not be voting for me the same way that I am in an election, and yet they're darling people who make great products. And I think this idea, whether it's sorghum syrup or these things, it's like there are all these ways still that we can get along. I remember that the podcast group StoryCorps, one day I'll hit those numbers, but they talk about that when they put people together and who have fractured beliefs, the first thing they don't want them to talk about is that. Like, anyways, I think to your point of there being a hopeful moment that, yeah, like, you get to know this farmer or the people that run my little local neighborhood market up here. I love them. They're great. And those are moments you come out of the place feeling more hopeful as opposed to kind of just reading headlines. So,
Yeah, it's a completely different lived experience than what is projected into our media system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm currently doing so you mentioned I'm also just curious too, for Emma, Bart, like kind of coming in, and Bart, I know you have to duck out in a couple of minutes, but I don't know, were there any super fun as you think about the products you learned about, the recipes that came in, were there any that, like, just top of mind jumped out at you? We talked about sorghum syrup. I'm using cultured butter into gin right now. We'll see how that turns out. Thank you, Monica Berg. But yeah, some of the recipes were fun in terms of seeing how people were thinking about using, Don Lee's nori and celery. But yeah, there were definitely some unique uses, I felt like, as I came across.
Yeah, I will say, maybe to tweak that question a little bit. One of my biggest takeaways in working on this book with Jim and through some of these, often complicated recipes that were very foreign to me. I've never made my own matcha, for example, or many of the items in this book that ultimately lead to the cocktail recipes that are in there as well. Jim and I had this interesting back and forth, right? Where I think Jim was also making a lot of this stuff for the first time as well, in his research. And so we had many late night calls of Jim walking me through the process, and maybe it was successful or it wasn't, and kind of showing me videos of the process, right? And many iPhone photos of not only the process, but the tools and the ingredients. And then I'm online researching these recipes as well and finding YouTube videos. And it was just a very interesting process to then illustrate these recipes, right, for an end user. And so I think I was able to approach it again with this like beginner's mindset, this completely unfamiliar position, and then try to illustrate it in a way that I felt communicated to someone who the material may be as foreign as it was to me, right? To communicate very complex ideas and processes in a way that was very understandable, right? And so as you go through this book, there's a lot of my own experiences in these recipes, and yeah, many of them I've employed in my own kitchen. I talked about the mint, the mint preservation, which I now use for a variety of herbs in my kitchen. We've made oleo saccharum with the kids to make lemonade. Like, there's a lot of fun stuff that we've been pulling out of the book at home, and yeah, I feel like I already know and have a handle on these recipes because I spent 5 years illustrating them.
Yeah, I think to what people see, it is nice that you can have certainly like a visual of a single page
Right.
trying to help you think about how do I go through this process in terms of time and heat and blenders, et cetera. So yeah, no, the progressive illustrations in terms of the how-to is fun because yeah, trying to take in processes sometimes is just a nightmare.
Yeah, and Jim and I talked a lot at the beginning of the book, and that was a decision, right? We kind of stood on the edge there, and we're like, are we really going to illustrate all of this? Or I was like that at least. But given the way people cook now, and it's often with an iPad propped up in their kitchen, watching. I think the best example of some of these videos are like either the Bon Appetit, videos, the kind of top-down cooking videos, or a lot of the work that Kenji does, and following, right? We do that so frequently. I don't know, how often people are pulling out cookbooks, reading line by line anymore. I think it's easier, just to kind of throw up a YouTube video. So like, what was a proxy for that, right? We wanted to keep people engaged in our book, and not, trying to set up an iPad at their bar or in their kitchen. So I think the natural answer was, well, let's kind of create our own version of that, right? And it's almost graphic novel-esque, and starting, and as you're mentioning, you see the equipment and the times and the overnights and the steeping and the stirring, and every gesture is explained. And I think, you're able to, again, work through what can be complicated recipes, hopefully with the ease of like following a YouTube video or a tutorial, essentially. And I think there's an advantage also to illustrating in that, sometimes you can't get the perfect camera angle, or maybe your strawberries look different than the ones in the book. And so we were able to kind of take, the most standard versions of tools and the most standard looking items, and we were able to kind of eliminate bias, right? Or people getting worried about maybe what the thing looks like in the middle of the process. And if you just follow our steps, it's going to turn out right? And so there was almost an advantage to being able to illustrate these things as opposed to photographing each step. I have the Tartine book is a book I've had for a very long time, making bread, and that is a kind of a step-by-step book, but it's done with photography. And I think that almost added to my stress in using that book, because my fermentation never looks as good as the one in the book. So we wanted to eliminate some of that. That's a wonderful book, but ours is great for different reasons.
I would agree real quick, and you guys have some in the book and it looks great, but I do think I've seen cocktail books with illustrations before, and I do think that, yeah, like when it's professionally photographed, it's like, it's just daring you to be like, and guess what's never going to look this good,
Right.
But
Right.
but but images are beautiful. And so I would agree that the abstraction kind of helps take that away. Bart, I know you have to run in a couple minutes, but Emma and Jim, is there anything we haven't covered at all, like regarding the book you want to talk about, the process? Anything, what's on your mind if we haven't covered anything so far?
I'm gonna let Emma start since I'm always wondering what's on her mind.
Oh goodness. Okay. Well, I think, one of the only other notes I took as we were chatting was just, I think one of the things that I love the most about what we've put together is, and hopefully I guess my hope, that people get out of it, is that by learning about each one of these categories of ingredients, on their own merits, and this kind of ties into, the way Bart has illustrated it. Every chapter starts with these elemental recipes, right? How to brew a great cup of this kind of tea or versus this kind of tea. The same for coffee, the same for how to carbonate your own soda, that kind of stuff. When you you learn about these ingredients, you learn how to prepare them in a very kind of classic, very like high quality kind of way. Not only are you going to make these ingredients better for use in cocktails, but you're also like, it ends up enriching your relationship with each category as well, right? So like, when you know the difference between Gyokuro green tea versus sencha green tea, and you know that each one should be steeped at a different, brewed at a different temperature, right? And you understand why, my daily tea ritual has become so much better, right? Like I've invested in an electric kettle, which I never thought I would do because I'm very old school in that respect. But now, I do follow the producer suggestions on what temperature to brew at and how long to steep for. And really every day has become more enjoyable for it. And I think that goes for the same thing as, vegetables and fruits and grains and dairy. Going through this and learning will make you a better barista. It'll make you a better cook. So it kind of touches on it is bigger than just the cocktails themselves, and that's something I think I'm very proud to have helped put together, and also it's lovely, and I hope people get that out of it as well.
So before we get to Jim, real quick, I'll say exactly to your point, Emma. This morning, literally this morning, and I'm a coffee nerd at heart, but I'm working with a new set of beans, and I dialed them a little too fine this morning, and it was tasting kind of bitter. And I was like, oh, I learned from the book. I'm like, I need a slightly more coarse grind and pull back some of that bitterness right there. But I was literally thinking of the passage from the book this morning as
That's awesome. Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, and I think that for me, going back to the lime juice and Dale DeGroff and kind of my origins in this industry, I think that is, if we look back in the last 20 years, the history of the history of our industry, especially the both the formal history and the recent history, have heavily been slanted towards the history of cocktails and lounges and sort of really bars that serve cocktails as opposed to restaurants. And where this book began before the pandemic was in thinking about what happened in the cocktail world when I think that, for instance, and granted I'm biased because I worked at Gramercy Tavern when I worked at the Pegu Club, but like when Barbara Lynch opened Drink and when Grant Achatz opened Alinea and when basically when Daniel Hume sort of opened Nomad and like we could go from city to city, but when Wiley Dufresne had a serious cocktail program with Eben Freeman here, Charles Fan and Slanted Doors program was historic, but when certain very high profile chefs decided that cocktails should be part of a great dining experience, around the same time that places like Pegu Club and Milk and Honey and high profile lounges that were not attached in any way to restaurants or to chefs. I feel like in many ways, like cocktails remain the redheaded stepchild of the culinary world. Like we now we're part of the Beard Awards, and we're sort of cocktail education is loosely part of culinary schools, but I don't feel that cocktails have been fully recognized as a full bird culinary art. And that a bartender sits in the like back of house with the pastry chef and the savory chefs. And while I don't want people to think that I am like some chef fanboy or that this book is chefy, or that I want the cocktail world to be more chefy. What I do think is that this book really sort of like very aggressively plants cocktails in the world, in the culinary world, and really sort of views them from the lens that a good chef regards their sourcing, the way they work with purveyors, and the importance that most great chefs understand intrinsically between great relationships with purveyors and being able to source great ingredients to make delicious food. And I think that this book, more explicitly than any other that I've ever read, that isn't like, so, I mean, I take that back. There are definitely some chefy cocktail books out there, but I think this book in a more, I think what Emma obviously did a lot for this book, but I think one of the things that she was really most instrumental in is that I feel like I have a lot of hot takes, as you can probably tell listening to me on this podcast. And I think Emma cools them down. And I think that like I've understood as a leader that if I want people to follow me, I have to inspire them. It's just a fact. And I know that I know that when people aren't following me, it's because the takes are getting too hot and I'm not explaining why I feel the way I do. So people just don't understand me. They think I'm like a guy talking too loud and too passionately. And so I think what the great service Emma did for this book was to like slow things down, to make sure that we were proving all of our points, to make sure that we were showing all of our sources. And I think that like this book I think that at the end of the day, I think when I haven't had too much coffee and I got enough sleep and like I got a hug, and a kiss goodnight, like I'm a nice person. But I think like at the end of the day, like I think Emma cooled this book down. So I think that it'll appeal to a large group of people who want to be inspired. And then they don't want to feel bad for not knowing what they don't know. And I think that where this book is successful is that I think that like two Midwesterners worked really hard to like be inspired.
Thank you, Jim. And also I would like to flag also that like I think it's super cool. There was definitely an opportunity here for Jim to just like put all his own recipes in this book. And instead he opened it up and he sourced cocktail recipes from like the best and brightest from all over the world. And I think that has made it a really vibrant and kind of similarly inclusive project that I think is really cool too.
I will agree. It is fun to kind of see things having come in, like just how many names, of course, I recognize, but also just seeing, the diversity from which things were pulled. And yeah, so, first, one of my long-term hopes, because I have kind of like increasingly adding a culinary or agricultural lens to my exploration, but I hope that with food having always been behind, or excuse me, cocktails having always been behind food in terms of their progression and when things started, hopefully we will continue to ascend that direction, because I agree that people could look at, artisanal lettuce or whatever in one way, but limes are just limes. And so I think for us to kind of think of that we owe the same level of respect to the drink, hopefully over time we'll get there. And yes, I'm also, I can at times also use, my girlfriend's pretty good for this too, but like I can also have too many hot takes in my own life and just like, well, calm down. Self-righteous feels so good coming out, but everybody's always just like that guy. So
right. So I'm glad that I had an internal smackdown device to kind of keep us our feet on the ground. And yeah, I think that it's a better, it's a warmer, more inspiring book, and I think that was, Emma had a lot to do with that. And I think, and also we were very well edited, Molly Birnbaum and And obviously meeting Bart, like Bart's such a nice person. He's such a cool, calm, and AJ, the photographer as well. So I feel like I surrounded myself with very reasonable, intelligent, kind, thoughtful people. And I feel like we've created a book that I think embodies the characteristics of the team that put it together.
Yeah. So the book, it's got its own little IG handle, the Bartender's Pantry. Comes out on June 11th, if I'm not speaking out of turn. What else do you want the people to know? Buy the book because Emma and Bart and Jim would appreciate it and because they're nice people. What else? Anything else to add about let's see, and we can find you online, Jim. What, your mixography? Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
And Emma's on there at Emma Jansen. We'll link out to all this, and Bart's at Bart Sasso. Other social handles, websites, anything we need to mention? I'll put all of it in the show notes too.
No, I mean, I would just say like this has been a really wonderful conversation. And I think Emma and we enjoy talking to each other, but we're really going to enjoy talking to readers. It takes about 30 hours to read this. Emma and I have done it 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 times. So after if they decide to spend 30 hours with our book, which is a lot to ask, we're really excited for this to, this is hopefully just going to build a big dialogue, and a lot of people, I'm sure we got some stuff wrong. I'm sure that there's new information that's come out since this has been printed, and we hope this is going to build a big dialogue, and that this is just the beginning of something much bigger than this book. So we're just really excited about that, right? For sure.
Yeah, and thanks, going back to kind of my comment about coffee, yeah, for just helping us kind of hopefully better think about where are the dogmatic stories that we tell ourselves and what information have we not considered because we believe that dogma. And so I think this certainly does that by digging into this next level of ingredients that we kind of know, but really don't probably know well enough. So thank you guys for taking time to chat today. I appreciate it. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd write us a review on whatever platform you listen on, or share an episode with a friend. The show notes are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. Happy cocktailing, everybody.